My name is Robert Brewer, and I'm a senior software engineer at Tableau. And now I work at the Palo Alto office of Tableau, but I didn't always live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I used to live in Honolulu, and this is how I go to work every day. Well, okay, not really, but that would have been nice. So after living in Honolulu for 20 years, I decided it was time to make a change, and I had this great opportunity to move to Denmark and work in Denmark for 2 years at Aarhus University there. So that was a great experience. However, the climate is slightly different in Denmark compared to Hawaii. In Denmark, it actually gets cold, and in winter, the days get short. But it was an awesome experience, an opportunity for me to live abroad and travel around Europe. And part of that was living in Honolulu and traveling around Europe gave me appreciation for delicious things. From this deep-fried rice ball filled with poke to the incredible pastries they have in Denmark. But now, I'm at Tableau, and for the last year and a half, I've been on the team that's been working to bring Tableau Server to Linux. We've been working really hard. This is our team at last year's TC, all wearing our Linux hats. And we have decades of Linux experience on our team, and we are very excited to be almost ready to bring you Tableau Server on Linux. If you're in this room, I know you're interested in Tableau Server on Linux. And I want to let you know that this was no cookie-cutter port of our Windows Server product. Tableau Server on Linux is native all the way down from farm to table. And we hope that you will enjoy the little bits of Linux deliciousness in Tableau Server almost as much as we enjoyed making them. So this talk is going to highlight those bits of Linux deliciousness in the context of setting up Server. And then along the way, I'm going to talk about our new administration system, Tableau Services Manager, which I'll refer to as TSM for the rest of this talk. And also I'll talk about our Linux security model. What this talk is not about is how to switch from Windows to Linux. We have a separate talk called Making the Switch, which you can find in the TC app. And also, this is not a deep dive on TSM, the Tableau Services Manager. There's a separate talk talking all about TSM's architecture if you're interested in that. So, for our menu today, we're going to start with an appetizer course. It'll be about preparing for Linux and what expectations you can have about running server on Linux. For our main course, we're going to talk mostly about installation and initialization of server. That's the bulk of the talk. Because we're doing this continental style, we're going to follow the main course with a salad, and that's going to be about upgrading, how we do upgrades on Linux. Then we're going to have a dessert course. We have a couple extra little bits of interesting stuff we do on Linux. And then finally, for your after-dinner mint, we'll do a quick recap, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So if I could ask you to hold your questions until the end, we'll have plenty of time for them. So, preparing for Linux. So you're probably wondering, what Linux distributions do we support? So if you think of Linux distros as a family tree with the abstract concept of Linux at the top of the tree, we support Red Hat Enterprise Linux, also known as RHEL, version 7. We also support CentOS 7 and Oracle Linux 7 because they are both derived from RHEL 7. And then in another branch of the tree, we don't currently support Debian Linux. We plan to do so in the future, but we do support Ubuntu 16.04, which is derived from Debian. And then finally, so on this side, we talk about the RHEL family tree. So we call those the RHEL-like distros. And then we call these the Debian-like distros. So throughout there's some things that are different on the different distros. And so when we talk about RHEL-like distros versus Debian distros, hopefully you now are up to speed. And then we'll also plan to support SUSE Linux, but we do not support it in our initial release. Got your photo? Okay. So talking about resource requirements, generally the resource requirements are the same as on Windows. So for a bare minimum proof of concept, just throw something together, you need to have 2 CPU cores and 8 gigabytes of RAM. Of course, you'd never want to run that in production. For production, we recommend 8 CPU cores and 32 gigs of RAM, and then on up, depending on your workload. Now, in terms of CPU cores, it's important that we count actual cores and not hyperthreads. So this is particularly important if you're deploying to a public cloud like AWS or Google Cloud Platform, because they often will call things vCPUs, virtual CPUs. What they really mean are those are hyperthreads. So if they say you have 6 to 8 vCPUs, really you only have 4 cores, and that won't be enough to run a production workload. So you really want at least 16 vCPUs to run Tableau Server in the public cloud. Other resources you need, obviously you need disk space. We install the binaries and stuff that Tableau Server runs on and into your installation directory, and that runs roughly 3 gigabytes and per version installed, so you want to have room for multiple versions, and I'll talk about that more later. Then there's also, of course, the data directory where all your data goes, and so you want to put all the maximum amount of disk space you want there, and we require at least 50 gigabytes to just install, but of course, in most organizations, you'll want much more than 50 gigabytes. Now, another thing that's a little bit different is that you want to make sure you have an account password set on the account that you're using to log into your Linux server. And this is because, as we'll cover later, to authenticate to TSM, you need to have a username and password. And this is important, in a little cloud note here, is that often when you deploy a server in the cloud, a VM, you often log into it via SSH with a public key. And so it's quite common that when you log into the server, you don't actually have a password set on that account. So then you need to set a password in order to log into TSM. It's very easy. Obviously, you have root access on your VM, right? So you just type sudo password and then the username you want to set the password for. Just make sure you do that. It's a common thing that people do the first time. They're like, why can't I authenticate? And it's because they just don't have a password even set on that account because they logged in via SSH. Now I want to talk a little bit about Tableau Services Manager. Obviously, there's a whole other talk about it, so this is just a brief introduction. What we're doing here is we've separated the management of Tableau Server from Tableau Server itself. In the current server product, they're quite intertwined, and now we sort of made this clear distinction between the two. So what we have are, in the center, REST API endpoints that you can connect to, and then we have clients, REST clients that just connect to those and then tell the controller to do certain things, and then the controller takes actions like, say, starting server or stopping server. But there's this clear distinction between the entity you connect to and tell it to do things, and then the actual server, which is being controlled. And Linux will ship as TSM only, so there's the classic tab admin that you come to know will not ship as part of Linux. Just to reiterate, so there's 2 distinct parts of Tableau Server on Linux. There's TSM and then server itself. In TSM, there are 5 processes. There's the controller, the agent, tab SVC, zookeeper, and a license service. And these services basically run all the time. So even when you have your server down, the TSM services are still running because otherwise you couldn't bring your server back up, your Tableau server back up. And then the server processes, they're all the same processes that you've come to know probably, Backgrounder, VizPortal, VizQL Server, and so forth. So there's this clear distinction. There's TSM and there's Tableau Server. TSM controls Tableau Server. In terms of differences for admins, installation, of course, is quite different, and that'll be the major focus of this talk. There's TSM, we just talked about. Data connectivity drivers. Most drivers are available on Linux, but not all. And in some cases, that's because the company or the database provider doesn't provide a Linux driver, in which case we don't have a Linux driver for you. So do check what drivers you use in your environment and whether they're available on Linux right now yet. We also do upgrades differently. I'm going to cover that section on that. But many things you know about server just remain the same. Configuration keys, if you know the configuration keys you like to set, those are still there. The services names I talked about before, and topology. In terms of differences for your end users, hopefully the only difference they will see is that if they look at the About box on server, it will say Linux instead of Windows. So there should be no differences for your end users using Tableau Server. All right, now let's move on to installation, our main course. So there are 3 different segments of the installation. First, you need to install the Tableau Server package, which is a Linux native package. Then you're going to initialize TSM, and then you're going to use TSM to initialize server. So we're going to go through each of these 3 steps in turn. First, package installation. So we use the native package format for distros. For RHEL-based distros, we use RPM, of course, and Debian, we use Deb. Our packages that we ship depend on other packages. So there are packages available in the public repositories that everybody uses on Linux, and some of our packages depend on some of those packages. So they will be automatically downloaded for you and installed as part of the installation process. On a RHEL-like distro, you're probably familiar with this, you just type sudo yum install and then the name of the RPM file that you've downloaded. On Debian-like distros, you type sudo gdebi-n Tableau Server and then your deb file. Now, the reason we use this tool called gdebi as opposed to apt-get, which you might be more familiar with, is because it works better with local packages. So it'll automatically download those dependent packages, whereas apt-get doesn't do that in the case of a local package. So the package layout. The installation directory will always be opt Tableau Server. That location is not configurable, but of course, if you're a Linux admin, you can mount whatever file system you want on that. You can create a symlink, whatever you want to do, but that's the path that will always be used by Tableau Server. Everything we install is owned by root and read-only. So nothing, after you've installed Tableau Server, that whole area is read-only. You don't need to make any changes in there. Everything will happen in your data directory or in a few other small places on your server, which are the appropriate places for those files. The overall layout, there's two, at the high level, there's a manifest directory and a packages directory. And within each of those, there'll be packages which are versioned. If you have good eyes, you might notice that there are double versions here. So there are side-by-side versions of Tableau Server in this installation. And I'm going to talk about that a lot more in the upgrade section, just pointing that out here. In terms of driver packages, drivers are installed separately, so that's a change compared to classic Windows. Some drivers are available directly from Tableau. That's in the case that if we need to repackage the driver or make some modification to it. But most of them will be downloaded directly from the database vendor. And those get installed, the drivers that we distribute get installed in opt Tableau driver. And for the ones that use ODBC, they'll use the standard etc ODBC INI file to control them. The layout of drivers in that directory is just the name of the driver and then the drivers in there. And one thing to note is that the Postgres driver is not installed by default, but we do actually need that driver to display admin views. So almost all server customers will want to install the Postgres driver, even if they don't use Postgres for their customer data, but Tableau uses Postgres internally. So to display those admin views, you have to install the Postgres driver. All right, so now we've installed the package. Now we're going to move on to initializing TSM. But before we do that, I need to give you a little bit of background on TSM because there's some differences, and it'll prepare you to understand why we do the things we do when we initialize TSM. So first, I want to talk about the TSM security model. We do privilege separation, just like many things do on Linux, to try to minimize the amount of code that runs at a higher privilege. So the TSM agent process runs as the privileged user. And the default username for the privileged user is TSM agent. Everything else, every other process that Tableau Server runs will run as the unprivileged user. And that default username is Tableau. So the way we provide privileges to the privileged user is through sudo. So during the initialization, we install our own sudoers file, which is in addition to your existing sudoers file. And the sudoers file completely enumerates the things that we run as root, right? So you can look at the sudoers file, and this is an exact list of every command we're allowed to run as root. If we tried to run a command that wasn't on that list, you wouldn't be able, it would fail. And we do this because there are certain things you just have to be root to do. For example, to open a port less than 1024 on a Linux system, you have to have root privileges in order to make that capability possible. Now, since the privileged user and the unprivileged user are both potentially creating files, we want to make sure that all the files that they use in common are accessible to both. So we create a group, which both of them are members of, and all the files are owned by that group. And we call that the server authorized group, and its default name is Tableau. And its important tidbit here is that this is the primary group. It has to be the primary group for both these users. So in Linux, you can be a member of many groups, but there's one group which is your primary group. If you create a file, then the default ownership of that file will be your primary group. And it's critical that that's true for these users. Of course, we create all these for you by default, but I'm just giving you some background here for people who want to modify these things. And in fact, all these user and group names are configurable. So if for some reason in your environment, maybe you already have a user named Tableau for something, you might want to change the name of the unprivileged user to something else. So you might be wondering, if you, Tableau Server admin, what happened to the run as user? So on Windows, all your processes, you can choose this run as user config key, and all their processes run as this user, and you can connect to databases as this user, and you can access file shares as this user. It all just sort of happens because Windows makes the magic happen. So on Linux, We don't get all that magic for free, but it gives us a lot more configurability. So you can actually have separate users configured for the privileged user, the unprivileged user, what user you connect to databases as, and how you connect to CIFS shares. So it's all very configurable, and you can make decisions about how you want to set up your configuration on your network. Now moving on to TSM access control, since it's a REST API endpoint, you need to authenticate somehow to it to say that you're authorized to make changes to Tableau Server. On Linux, we delegate everything to the OS. So on Linux, that means we're using PAM, the pluggable authentication modules, which are standard on pretty much every distro. So this means we benefit from whatever PAM policies are in place. So if you have auditing in place, if you have throttling, so if you try to make 1,000 attempts to authenticate, you might slow down the rate at which you allow authentication attempts to happen. And also, whatever directory service you have configured for PAM just works for TSM access control. So if you have AD set up so you can log into your Linux box via SSH with your AD account, then that'll work for TSM as well. The authentication does happen via username and password. The way we check that the username and password that you provide to TSM is valid is we run this SU command under the covers with that username and password and see if we get a successful response. So if you can run SU on your Linux box as the user with your username and password, then you'll be able to log into TSM. We've run into some customers who had changed their SU, for whatever reason, their SU configuration wasn't working properly, and then that would prevent them from logging into TSM. So that's something to check if you run into that. Now, that allows you to authenticate to TSM, but of course, you probably don't want everyone in your AD domain to be able to authenticate to TSM and make changes to your server. So we authorize which users are able to do that by membership in a group. And that group is the TSM authorized group, and by default, we call that TSM admin. So you have to be a member of group TSM admin on the Linux box in order to successfully do commands with TSM. So here's the overview. There are 2 users and 2 groups. We create the privileged user and the unprivileged user, which have default names. And then they share this server group, which for the file access. And then separate from that, there's the TSM access group, TSM admin, which is all about how you authenticate and be authorized to TSM. So now you've got the TSM background, hopefully. What happens when we actually initialize TSM? So one thing you might be asking is, why do we have to do this as a separate step? Why don't you just, when you install the package, why don't you just do all this for me? And the answer is that when you install packages, you're not allowed to provide additional parameters. So you can't say, for example, you want to choose where the data directory goes. You don't like our default. Well, we want you to be able to change that, but you can't do that if we did all this initialization during the package installation time. Initialize TSM, it's just a shell script called initialize-TSM. You run it as root. It has lots of configuration options, like your data directory, user and group names, other things. However, the defaults work for most customers. In terms of functionality, it's going to create those users and groups. It's going to create the data directory. The default data directory path is var opt Tableau Server. Of course, you can change that, but that's the default that we pick for you. It'll add you to that TSM admin group, and that's critical. So the user who's running the script, that user will be added automatically to this TSM admin group. And if you don't do that, if for some reason that fails, then you can't do the rest of the installation, because the next steps are going to require you to authenticate to that TSM service that you've installed. Now, as a convenience, we also add you to that server group that we use to keep the privileged and unprivileged user working together. And that's just a convenience so that you can CD into the logs directory and read the logs directly without having to sudo to root. So that's just a convenience. If you don't want to do that, you don't have to, and server works just fine. It's just for convenience for admins. One thing to note is that on Linux, when you get added to a group, the shell that added you to that group doesn't get the group update, because your shell doesn't know that new group has been added. So you want to log out and log back in before you can look at log files the very first time. And then finally, of course, it installs and starts the TSM services. One thing to note is that initialize TSM should be run once. It's not something that you run more than once. And you only need it the very first time, and it's not part of upgrading to a new version. So resist the urge to ever run initialize TSM again, unless you're really like wiping the server and starting from scratch. And there are also many of the options you provide to initialize TSM can't be changed after initialization. So the choice for the users and groups, your data directory path, and so forth, those are sort of baked into the configuration. Of course, you can wipe everything, but if you say you just want to change the path for the data directory, there's no way to do that. So choose wisely. Of course, if you're doing this production setup, you want to make sure you know what you're doing. If you're doing a proof of concept, of course, you can just throw it away. VMs are cheap. So how do TSM services run? We run our TSM services directly through systemd, which is a standard way on Linux to run things. It's standard on most distros, and in fact, it's a hard requirement for Tableau Server. So one of the reasons there's some of the distros we don't support, it's because they don't support systemd. For example, RHEL 6 didn't have systemd, so you can't run Tableau Server on RHEL 6. We installed the manifests into etc systemd system directory, so you can go and look at the manifests that we've run to run the TSM services. The TSM services are controlled by the systemctl command you may be familiar with as an admin. Now, rarely you should never need to control these directly. We do all that for you as part of Tableau Server, but if for some reason you needed to, you just run systemctl status and then the name of the service, in this case, tabadmin controller, and you'll see that in this case it was running, and you can see the process ID and so forth. We do, as part of initialization, initialize some other files. We create this thing called the environment file. And this stores critical configuration information like the location of your data directory. Since you can choose any arbitrary place on your file system to put the data directory, we have to know where to look when you're starting up services. So there's always this sort of north star, which is etc opt tableau server environment.bash. That file and that path you can't change, but that file tells us where the data directory is and some other things. Now, of course, as Linux admins, once you install a piece of software, you expect to be able to run it just be part of your path. So the way we do that is we add things to your path through installing a file into etc profile.d directory, just adding those things to your path. And then last, we add the sudoers file I mentioned earlier. We just add a little file into the sudoers.d directory, which is created exactly for this purpose. All right. Let's do a live demo of initializing TSM, because nothing ever goes wrong during a live demo. So in this VM here, running on AWS, I've just taken the opportunity to install the package. So this is what you see after you install. And you can see that the very first thing, where's my cursor? OK, anyway, if you see halfway down here, it tells you how to run initialize TSM. And the way you do that is you type sudo opt Tableau Server. File name completion is very helpful here. Scripts, initialize TSM. So I'll run that. Oh no, it told me I didn't accept the end user license agreement. So I go off and read that very carefully, and then I run initialize TSM, and I accept the user license agreement. So it started up. So what's it doing? First off, it's going to create those groups that we talked about, the Tableau group by default and the TSM admin group. You have to create the groups first because you can't add someone to a group that doesn't exist. It creates the Tableau user. It creates that TSM agent user. It creates the directories we need, for example, the data directory, and make sure the permissions on that are correct. It adds, my user that I logged into this VM is CentOS, and so it's adding that to group Tableau, and it's adding it to group TSM admin. And it's reminding me that I have to log out and log back in if I want to use that group membership. It's adding the sudo privileges. It's creating the environment file. And then it's installing the services. And while it's installing the services, I'm going to have a drink of water. Any moment now. There we are. So now it's installed. And it tells you can interact with the REST API endpoint. So, for example, the command you run is called TSM, which is not in my path yet for this shell. So this is one of these things where the very first time you install, of course, it's set it up so the next time you log in, it'll be in your path. But it's not in my path right now. So I have to type up a manual command to put it in my path, which is printed in the output of the command right here. We just source the profile, Tableau Server. All right. So now it's in my path. And I'm done. So I'm done initializing TSM. Yay, it worked. Of course it was going to work. Nothing ever goes wrong during a live demo. So now we've initialized TSM. We're going to move on to step 3, initializing server. And the way you do that is through the TSM command line interface. At least that's the way I'm going to do it here. So the TSM command is kind of like tabadmin that you might be familiar with, except it's now different because it's TSM. So TSM is separate from Tableau Server. So the TSM command line program is just a thin REST API client that sends requests to the tab admin controller, and then the tab admin controller does the work. So for example, if you were to start a backup, you're basically, the client will say, I would like to start a backup. It sends a request to the server, to the controller starts the backup. If you lost your shell session, the backup's still going. It's all fine. In fact, you can reconnect to running commands and so forth. So it's not like the command TSM is not actually doing the work. It's just telling the controller to do the work. It will prompt you for a username and password if you haven't authenticated already, and it stores it into a little session cookie that we keep around, so you don't have to keep typing in your username and password every time you do commands, but of course that times out after, I think, 2 hours by default. And all communication between the TSM client and the controller is secured via TLS. And we create a self-signed certificate for that purpose. So you can be sure that your username and password and any information is secured and encrypted. So we have oodles of commands you can run. For the full list, you can type TSM help commands. All of your favorites are there, like backup, restore, ziplog, start, and stop. However, we have so many commands now, we decided that we wanted to organize them. So they're organized into categories and subcategories. For example, under authentication, you might want to configure Kerberos authentication. And then under that subcategory, there's configure, enable, and disable, and so forth. So it makes more sense, but there's now like a hierarchy of commands. Let's do a live demo of initializing server. All right. So switch back to my shell here. I have TSM in my path now. So I'm going to type TSM, and I'm like, what are all those commands? I wish I could remember if there was some way if I could hit the tab key and then get a list of all the commands there. So TSM supports command line completion. So you can see a list of all the commands. In this case, the first thing we need to do is license this server. So I'm going to type in li and hit tab because I don't like typing. Oh, wait, before I do that, I have the beta key here, the beta license we provide. I just need to find my cursor. All right, there we go. Huh. It's very small. I'm going to copy that to my clipboard, and then I'm going to run TSM licenses activate. Oh, wait, before I do that, let's just do a TSM status -v. And it's prompting me for a password because this is the first time I've used it. And so it's telling us that the 5 services that make up TSM, they're installed and they're all running, but server as a whole is, of course, stopped because we haven't initialized server at all. So we're going to do TSM licenses activate, and what's that command line? Okay, it's -- license key, and then I'm going to paste that license key on the command line, hit return. And so this is now contacting the Tableau license server and authorizing this license. It's just long enough to make an uncomfortable pause in my presentation. And it comes back any minute now. There we go. License key is activated. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is going to register server. So from the command line, the way we do that is you create a little JSON file which has your registration. And I have an example one here, registration.json. So it just includes the things you've probably done before as when you're registering Tableau Server, your name and address and so forth. So I will register with TSM registrar and -- file and registration.json. So it's going to send off that little JSON file to our registration server. That's done. So now we need to configure server. But we're just doing a proof of concept here. I don't care. I'm just going to use all the defaults. The one thing you do have to pick is what authentication mechanism you want to use. And the reason for that is because once you pick that and you initialize server, you can't change it. So we want to make sure that you're making you're not accidentally getting a default. In our case, we only want local authentication. So I have a little config file. We store our config files in JSON. And we now have this concept of config entities. So often there's a group of parameters which are semantically similar. They're part of configuring the same thing. And we want to be able to do things like validation on them. And so in this case, we're setting the identity store entity, and we're saying that we want to just have local authentication. So this is the simplest config file you can actually have. And we're going to load that in by doing TSM settings import -- import config file config.json. So this will happen quite quickly. So under TSM, the way we do settings is that we don't instead of setting things one at a time, you create a shopping cart of settings. So you can make as many settings changes as you want, set config entities, set traditional configuration keys, and then you apply them all at once as one atomic operation. And then at that time, we validate things like, say, if you're trying to authenticate to an AD server, set up AD authentication, we'll test that the username and password or the Kerberos settings you have are correct, and you can actually do that to the AD server. So before you try to actually initialize server, we'll tell you, oh, you actually have something that's not quite right, or maybe you picked an inappropriate or illegal topology for your cluster. So the way you go ahead and say, I'm ready to apply these changes is you say TSM pending changes apply. And then this goes off and does that. If you had a cluster, of course, it would be like changing the configuration across everything in the cluster. That's why there's lots more output, because it can take more than a second or two if you have a cluster. All right, so now we're ready to initialize server. So I'm going to run TSM initialize with the start server flag. So we'll end up with a running server. And I'll start that. And this takes roughly 10 minutes, which is more than we want to wait for this presentation. So like any good cooking show, I'm going to switch over here. Oh. And here, it's done. OK, on my other server. So now we've initialized server. So server is now initialized and running. If I do TSM status -v, we'll see that server's running, and all these processes that you are familiar with are running. The last thing we have to do here is to create the initial admin user. So when you're running the current Windows product, it will pop up a browser, and they will ask you to type in a username and password. Of course, you don't want to install Firefox on your Linux thing just so you can install the username and password for the initial user. So you just use tab command to do that. With tab cmd, initial user, you tell it which server you want to connect to, which is localhost. And this is a security feature, right? If you install server, you don't want someone else in your corporate LAN to be able to like get in there before you do and set up your initial admin user. So this can only be run. This command can only be run from localhost on the server, which presumably you have secured. And we pick a username, admin, and then we're going to read the password from a file called admin password. And then there we go. OK, so it's set up. And now, switch over to Firefox here. Go to my bookmarks. And here is our Tableau server, which should be bigger. And we're going to log in with our username. And all right, there we are. This is Tableau server. And we can go into samples and look at Superstore. And it renders. There we are. There's Superstore. And if we look at About Tableau Server, here we are, we have Linux. So that's sort of the fastest path to setting up Tableau Server. Well, not quite the fastest. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, so that's done. So we've initialized Tableau Server. So you might be wondering, what about worker nodes? In TSM, there's no distinction between nodes. So there's just the initial node and then the additional nodes that you might want to add. Use the same installation package. There's no special worker installer or anything. What you do is, after you set up the initial node, you use this command, TSM topology nodes get bootstrap file, and then give it a file name, and it'll create this little bootstrap file. Then you copy that file to the other node you want to set up in the cluster, and then you install the package. And you have to initialize, you run initialize TSM with some additional arguments to set up the bootstrap file. And of course, you have to provide this additional node with the username and password for TSM that can authenticate, because you have to have, tell TSM that you're allowed to add a new node to this cluster. You don't want just anyone to be able to add a node to the cluster. OK, so we talked about these 3 steps. What if there was an easier way to do all this? And in fact, there is. It's called the automated installer, and it does all 3 of these steps for you. So what is the automated installer? It's just a bash script, and it will install, initialize TSM, and initialize server. It's fully customizable. It has parameters. It has all the same parameters you have initialized TSM, plus some additional ones, like providing the configuration file, the license key, and so forth. It's completely automatable, so anytime it uses a password, you can store that into a secrets file, and then so you can run this completely automated fashion. And thing to note here is Tableau uses this tool extensively in our testing internally. So you know that if this tool breaks, then someone gets called immediately. So that means as a customer, you know it's always going to work. It's not something not supported that could linger. And here's an example invocation. I'm not going to go through all the command line parameters, but basically it's initialize TSM plus some additional stuff. So how do you get it? The problem here is there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? This package installs server, so the script can't be inside the server installation package. So what we do is we distribute it as a separate package. And you just install it via yum or gdebi. It's versioned alongside Tableau Server, so whenever we have a release of Tableau Server, alongside will be the automated installer version for that release. We plan to host the source for this on GitHub, so we can get your feedback on how we can make it better. And it installs into a location, Tableau Server, automated installer, and then the version of Tableau Server. Now, when would you not want to use the automated installer? I use it all the time, but if you're doing a first-time install, it's often easier to correct. If you have some issues, it's easier to correct them sort of step by step, as opposed to doing this thing that does everything and goes, oh, I failed somewhere along the line. You have to figure out which step it failed at. It's much easier when doing it the first time to do it step by step. The other thing is that parameter validation, again, if you're setting up Active Directory for your server the first time, if you make a typo in your password, when you do that apply pending changes, it will say, oh, there's something wrong with this. You can fix it right then and then go on to the next step. Yeah, if you use automated installer, of course, it'll go to that step and just fail, and then you have to figure out why it failed at that step. So that's the automated installer. Now we're going to move on to our upgrades course. So the first thing I want to get out of the way is that we're kind of violating Linux packaging norms here. So normally when you have a package on Linux, you upgrade it by saying sudo yum update and then the name of your package. The problem is that Tableau Server upgrades require more tender love and care than yum and apt provides. So what we do is we make the name of the package that you install actually includes the version number as part of the name. And you can see that right here. We take two different RPMs for different versions here. And if you use the RPM tool to look at the name of the package, instead of being just Tableau Server in both cases, one case is Tableau Server with this, the September 8th, and the other one is a build from September 20th. So that's actually part of the name of the package. So when you upgrade Tableau Server, you're not really upgrading an existing package in the Unix package manager system. You're adding a new package. We're going to go over that in more detail now. So our paradigm here is that you always install the new package version. As I mentioned before, all the bits that we install are versions, so you can have as many versions living side by side as you want. And then the upside of this is that installing a new package is completely harmless. You can install as many new versions of Tableau Server as you want on a production server, and it will not harm that production server in any way. So that's a nice thing for admins. So you could have a cron job every day at midnight. It downloads the latest version of Tableau Server and installs it. Now, of course, it's not actually active then, but it's ready to be upgraded. For clusters, you need to install the new package by yourself on every node in the cluster. But we figure as Linux admins, you already have ways to keep your cluster packages up to date. So you just use the same mechanism you're using already. Then, when you're ready to actually have the new version of Tableau Server come into place, then you run something called the upgrade TSM script on the controller node. Then that'll upgrade Tableau Server, and then when it's done, you'll have Tableau Server running. And then at your leisure, you can delete the old package just to save disk space. That deleting of the old package doesn't affect your server at all because it's already switched over to using the new version install bits. This means that the corollary to this is that you never actually use the update feature of your package manager. You could, but it just doesn't do anything. So I'm going to walk through a little example here of how you would have updated from beta 1 to beta 2. So say you're running version 1, which has this version string, beta 1. You install the new package, which has a new name and version. And you can do this whenever. It doesn't take down your server at any time. You just install the package. Of course, you're a prudent admin, so you back up your server. Then you upgrade the data to the new version and start server. And you run the upgrade TSM script. Now make sure you always run the upgrade TSM script from the version you want to upgrade to, right? Because that one knows about that version and the previous version, whereas if you run the old upgrade TSM script, it doesn't know about the new version. You make sure your server's running okay. Sometime in the far-off future, when you want to save some disk space, you just run sudo yum erase and then the old version number, and then that just saves some disk space, but doesn't touch your running server at all. So a couple upgrade don'ts. Don't uninstall the running version. So we've had people, like, if you think about the existing paradigm for Linux server, you might think, oh, I uninstall the old version, I reinstall the new version, but you don't do that. Don't do that. If you do that, you can recover. So all you have to do then is reinstall the package you accidentally just uninstalled, and this is the one time you can actually rerun Initialize TSM. It handles this case and goes, I see, you just accidentally uninstalled the version you're running. I'll just restart the TSM services, and since your data directory isn't touched when you install and uninstall packages, the data directory is all secure. We don't touch that as part of the package installation process. Also remember, don't run Initialize TSM from the new version. You don't need to run Initialize TSM except that first time. You always run Upgrade TSM. So now just to give you the whole picture, it's sort of the server lifecycle. You install package the very first time, you initialize TSM, you initialize server. Then a great new version of Tableau comes out with features you really want. What do? You install the new package, you run the upgrade TSM command whenever you're ready. You can schedule that for whatever your downtime window is. And then sometime later, you uninstall the old package to free up some disk space, and then you just keep going through that whenever you get a new version of Tableau Server. All right. So now we're going to talk about the dessert course. So we have something called the obliterate script. So sometimes you really want to start from scratch, and you want to just wipe Tableau Server completely off of your system. And so we have this thing called the obliterate script. It removes almost all traces of Tableau Server. It will definitely delete all of your workbooks, all of your extracts, all of your users, everything. So this is something that you don't want to do on a day-to-day basis. It'll also remove the server packages. It's just called Tableau Server Obliterate, and it lives in the scripts directory along with everything else. And let's just go do that. It's so fun to obliterate server. So Tableau Server, packages, scripts, Tableau Server. And now, to be really, really sure you want to obliterate server, you have to give 3 Y arguments on the command line. You have to do -y, -y, -y. I'm really, really sure I'm going to delete my data, and I'm OK with this. So when you're doing proof of concept or you're testing out some new version, this happens, right? You install a version, and then you're like, oh, I want to install the next beta. Well, maybe if you don't care about your data, you might just use obliterate to obliterate the server and then install the new package. And it produces a lot of output. It's deleting the users, it's deleting groups, it's removing packages, and now Tableau Server has been obliterated from this system. All right. Oh, and then one last thing. So one thing that might happen is you're like, oh, I want this VM for whatever reason, I don't want Tableau Server on it anymore, so I uninstall the package, but wait, I really wanted to obliterate server. I wanted to get all traces of Tableau Server off of it. But how can I run the obliterate script because it's part of the package I just deleted? Well, we got you covered. We stash a copy of the obliterate script into var temp for just this circumstance. So if you look in var temp, you can find the obliterate script. So if you accidentally uninstall the package, you can always get it that way. And then this final little tidbit is TSM tab command are what we call bash jars. This is just a little geeky tidbit. So what's a bash jar? A Java jar, which is how we run the Java code in server, is just a zip file, basically, which has a bash script prepended to it. So when you run TSM, what's happening is you're running a bash script, and then the last step in the bash script is use this file as input to Java, and it runs TSM. So it means that we have a single self-contained file that has everything that you need to run TSM or tab command. In fact, it works so well that we decided to port this to Windows. So on Windows, in the future release, TSM and tab command will also be a single command, which uses the batch script instead of a bash script. All right. So in closing, let me recap briefly. We had our appetizer course where we talked about preparing for Linux, what distributions we support, what resources you need. And then we talked about our main course, which is about installation and initialization, which covers things like installing the package, initializing TSM, initializing server. Then we talked about upgrades, where we do things a little differently, but on the whole, I think admins are going to be happy with this. It means you can install the packages whenever you want. There's no downtime for installing the packages, and then you just schedule the downtime just for this brief window when you want to upgrade between the two versions. And then finally, we talked about obliterate and bash jars. So I want to ask you all to fill out surveys for this talk. We try to make Tableau Conference better each year, and so we're eager to hear your feedback on this session and all the sessions here today. And maybe I've left you hungry for more. If you haven't tried Tableau Server on Linux, please sign up for beta access. You can just go to tableau.com/getbeta. And then you'll be, after you sign up for the beta program, you'll have access to our brand new pre-release site, which is pre-release.tableau.com. And we just released beta 4. So go and try that. If you've already tried some of the earlier betas, we'd really encourage you to try upgrading to beta 4. And if you're running Tableau Server, please let us know what feedback you have about Tableau Server on Linux, because that's how we get this product better. And we've incorporated a lot of feedback from customers. So if you have a problem or some scenario you want us to support better, if you let us know, then we can do that, and we can make Tableau Server better together. And that's all I have. So I have about 15 minutes for questions. Thank you very much. If you could, so we have one mic over here. So if I could ask people who want to ask questions to just come over to the mic here, so that way everyone can hear and I don't have to repeat all the questions.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey. Quick question. Does the restore command work for backups created on Windows Server?
Correct, yes. So you can do a backup on your Windows server and then copy that file to your Linux server, and you can do a restore, and that works.
Okay. And does the auto install come pre-bundled with some of those default JSON files that you showed us as part of the manual install?
Yeah, so basically that sort of most minimal one is actually in the installer. The rest, we have extensive documentation, because we actually tried having a JSON file that had like templates and so forth, and JSON doesn't allow comments. So basically it was very hard to say like, this thing, you need to put this password. So it's all in the documentation site.
Okay. And does the Linux server support basically all of the Tableau Server features for Windows, like trusted authentication?
Correct.
All
yes.
those built-in features.
I guess I won't say there are cases, like for example, we don't have access to Microsoft Access, because Microsoft doesn't make a Linux driver for Microsoft Access,
right.
So we don't support that. There are a couple edge cases where there's something very specific to Windows OS where we don't support it.
But for the most part,
yes,
it's all there.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Same question.
Hi. Thank you. It was great. Can the data tier be a symlink?
Yes.
So then I can use that device to change it around.
Correct. Yes. I haven't tested extensively with that because we have the ability to change the data directory. But yes, just in Linux, basically you could even remount a different file system on that mount point if you want.
Perfect.
Hi. One of the earlier betas I know didn't support SAML authentication. Is that supported now?
I believe so. I have not personally tested SAML, but as far as I know, SAML is supported. And if it's not, then let us know.
Okay.
If it's not working for you, I guess specifically.
Hi. The uninstall command, does it cover...
Can you move the mic a little bit closer? Thanks.
The uninstall command, does it cover deactivation of license?
No, it does not.
Okay. Do we need to manually do that?
So yes, we would encourage you to, you wanted to deinstall deinstall your license. And one of the reasons we don't do that is because some people do offline licensing, right? Because they have an air-gapped environment. So in that case, we can't really actually do that for you. So we decided to just let that be up to the customer.
Okay. And while adding the new worker, how does that activation for that worker happens?
So when you go through the worker install, you actually do the other steps. That you do on the main. You just have to modify the initialize TSM step to provide that bootstrap file so it can, and the TSM username and password in order to link it into the rest of the cluster.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do configuration changes like tab admin set still require a restart, and is it as painstaking as it is on Windows?
The answer is mostly yes. So we're working towards those things. Obviously, we know that's a priority for admins, but and in fact, TSM exists to basically allow us to leverage those in the future. But for the initial release, most of the things that require a restart right now will still require a restart.
It takes the same amount of time.
We're still in the beta stage right now, so I don't want to say like it's faster or slower in that. But I know that one thing that's nice is that TSM knows which things require a restart, so it'll do the restart for you. Oh, cool. And it will also, if you're doing a command that will require a restart, it will say, if you're doing it interactively, it will say, this is going to cause a restart. Are you ready? Are you sure you want to do that? And you can say yes or no. You can override that for automation.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So what is the main driver for migrate to Linux? How do I convince my senior management or team members? Am I expecting double performance or quadruple? Or?
So yeah, again, on the performance thing, we're expecting at the very least parity. And we're still in the beta stage, so obviously it's not the final release. But in terms, for most customers, at least the customers that I've dealt with in the beta process, it's derived from there internally. So we have customers that are all Linux, and the only reason they run Windows is to run Tableau Server, which we're very appreciative of. But obviously they're going to be like, okay, as soon as I can, I want to convert those servers over to Windows. Over to Linux from Windows. Another big driver for people is people who are going to use the public cloud. So if you run an AWS instance of Windows versus an AWS instance using one of the free Linuxes, it can be less than half the price to run a Linux. So you could potentially cut your hosting costs in half if you're using a public cloud. So that's going to be a big motivator for a lot of people. And just in general, a lot of people who are doing sort of larger server deployments, I think in my experience, there's a lot of people who use Linux. So it's just sort of, they do a lot of other things on Linux. You run your web servers on Linux probably. You run a lot of other things. So just why not run Tableau Server on Linux? We also, if you're familiar with Linux, I mean, it's a lot more scriptable, configurable, and we try to support that as much as we can in Tableau Server. So if you want sort of the finer grained control over your deployment and configuration, I think some customers will have a better experience on Linux, but on the same token, like if you're a Windows shop, we're not saying go run Tableau Server on Linux just because it's there. That's going to be a worse experience for you because then you have to learn how to administer Linux. So I think it really depends on the customer, and it's just we want to make this available to customers who want Linux. And with the availability of VMs these days, it's so easy. Like I had a customer come by the enterprise kiosk in the data village, and he's here in the audience, and he had a laptop, and he installed, had an Ubuntu VM, and we did install a Tableau Server, the beta, right there. And so that's something that's just a lot easier because the overhead of a Linux operating system is much less than Windows, so it's a lot easier to do VMs and not worrying about licensing and all that kind of stuff for the OS. Thank you.
Hopefully 2 quick ones. Firstly, expose my Linux experience. We tried the beta and we hit the issue with the CentOS password, needing a password. So what's the kind of, how would you handle that typically?
Right, so the account that you log into does have to have a password, and I have in one of the earlier slides, you can just run a command sudo password and then the username, and then they'll set a password for the account.
Yeah, and that doesn't affect the OS at all by doing that?
Well, it doesn't affect the OS, it affects that account having a password. It didn't have a password, and now it has a password.
Yeah. I think we're using the CentOS username. I think that's why I was a bit worried about running it originally.
That should be fine. In fact, CentOS by default doesn't allow password authentication for SSH, so it doesn't allow anyone to log into the machine via that username and password, at least via SSH.
Okay. And then real quick, are there any plans to introduce something to help orchestrate the driver installs?
Yes, so I didn't include in my presentation here, but obviously our long-term plan is to have a Tableau repository where you just say you install the little pointer that points to our repository, and then you could just say yum install Tableau Server, and then in that case we can say Tableau Server depends on these other drivers, and then you could get all the drivers for that. We just can't do that right now because we're distributing the package files individually, but that's definitely the plan long-term.
Great, thanks.
Hi, so when we're doing an upgrade, so if something fails in between, so does it roll back to the existing package or existing installation?
Right now, it is not. Obviously, that would be a desirable feature that we've heard from customers. Okay. So in this case, you probably would want to take a backup. That's just a good general advice is to back up before you upgrade.
Okay, so we cannot even uninstall the upgrade package, right? So we'll have to remove it entirely and reinstall the existing one, or how
correct?
Do we do
Yes.
that?
If you wanted to roll back to a previous version right now, what you'd have to do is you have your backup. You would you can obliterate server and then install the old package, initialize, and then restore your data.
All right.
Obviously, I mean, obviously we strive for upgrades you don't need to roll back, but we'd like to make the rollback process better in the future.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, your presentation was great.
Thank you.
I have 3 questions.
Sure.
First, you said we have to acquire the driver. So SQL Server is a Windows-based, so do we need to have a separate ODBC driver for SQL Server?
Correct, yeah. So we have driver, Microsoft produces, I think, yes, I mean, there is a freely available Linux driver for SQL Server.
So Tableau is going to provide that, or we have to get it?
I mean, I think SQL Server is one of the ones that we actually package and
Okay.
release. Yeah, I had to double check on that, but
Okay.
it is available. We use it internally.
Okay. Is it open source by any chance? Do you know whether it's open source or data direct?
Oh, you mean
The driver that you guys are using
right.
internally?
I believe we're using the free DTS open source one, and I think we've experimented also with the Microsoft provided one.
Okay.
And I think I'm not on the connectivity
Okay.
team, but
Sure.
my understanding is that there were some issues with that one, and it's still in progress. So basically, we just provide whichever one we think works better.
Oh, thanks. Second question, that authentication, you said you are still using only one authentication. So do you have any plan to add more directory services like Oracle, or if I want to use 2 directory services configured?
Oh, I see.
Updating the JSON file, just updating the JSON file.
Yeah, so yeah, I guess I'm afraid I'm not the right person to ask that question, but if you come by the enterprise booth at in the data village, we have a kiosk there, and
Sure.
I can find someone to ask.
And the last question, so since it's a Linux, can I have a multiple instance installation on the same server?
No, we don't support that right now.
No, I'm saying technically I can do that.
Correct. Yeah. Essentially, when you install the packages, you
Yeah.
have multiple versions installed.
Different
just not-
volume, different file system, I can add it.
Yes, I guess I would say we don't support that, but obviously, as you can see, there are ways you could do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, great presentation.
Thank you.
One quick question. On Linux, the fonts are licensed, right? So
Yes.
how does Tableau handle that? When you install vanilla Tableau on Linux, what fonts will be available?
Right. So we have a license for the standard set of fonts that we use in Tableau, and including the Tableau font. We have a Tableau font. And then we respect whatever fonts you have also in your installation. So we provide a set that sort of should match like a minimal Windows type. Like for example, we have like the standard fonts that you get on Windows. We have license for those for Tableau Server.
Okay. So we don't have to go with the task along with users trying to see what they developed their
Correct.
workbooks in, right?
If you're using like a non-Latin character set like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, we can recommend. I mean, in most cases, if you have Linux set up for that and you're localized to that environment, you probably have those fonts installed. But we don't install any CJK fonts as part of Tableau Server.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you all for coming. And if you have more Linux questions, we have this enterprise kiosk down in the data village, and there should be a Linux person there all the time that it's open. Thank you very much.